Today in the class, I kind of want to follow a practice that I used or utilized in the lesson yesterday evening and look at an Old Testament passage and make some applications. And being that it is a class, maybe we could go through a little bit more the actual context and learn about 1 Samuel chapter 17. So I'd like you to turn there and look with me to that text. We'll discuss it in just a little bit. Most everyone is familiar with the account of David's battle with Goliath. It's a favorite in teaching the children's classes, but it may be a while since you have read it, and there are certainly some very strong applications that we can make to our daily lives. The lessons all today are basically intended for that, to better equip us as Christians to live for Him and to serve Him as we should. But it is something that kids like to talk about. David slaying Goliath and little David, big Goliath, and those kinds of things. In fact, it is that at West Side, it's been a number of years, 30 years ago or more than 30 years ago when I first started preaching West Side, there was a lady who taught the, I would say 2-3-year-old class, wasn't it? First graders? Okay, she was the first grade class. Her name was Velma Stanley. And she's since passed away a long time ago, but she created a life-size Goliath figure using just paper and a drawing, nothing fancy, but a PVC pipe to hold it up. And we still use that thing. I've got a picture of it right here. Even some of the grown-ups, they want to stand with it. And there's nothing pretty, but it does give you kind of an idea of just about how large that Goliath was. And as you contemplate just a regular person standing up. Zoe, she's not real tall, but she's not real short either. And when you look at them standing before it, you see that was really an imposing figure on that occasion. I want to spend a little time talking about the battle between the Philistines and the Jews, and make a few comments and applications about that. Let's start with the context. The big battle was in the Valley of Elah, with the two armies arrayed across the valley from one another on mountains on each side. I've got an image up here just so that you can see it. It's not the best picture, but it does have, fortunately, certain labels that are given to it that helps. And reading from 1 Kings chapter 17 and noting this, in noting this in 1 Kings chapter 17, it said, the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle. They were gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side with a valley between them. So if you can look at that, this taken from the view of Azekah, or Azekah, excuse me, as we look at it and looking out toward where the armies would be, there is, as we see, the Philistines were encamped in Ephes Dammim. Saul and his army encamped in the valley, and the armies drew up in battle array on the hills on each side of the valley, and that's where David met Goliath. There is a dry creek bed there, and that dry creek bed is probably, although we don't know that for certainty, but it's probably where he picked up his stones. It would be a good place to have those kinds of stones that he would use in his sling to meet Goliath in the valley. And after the battle, the text indicates that the Philistines fled along the road to Shaaraim. All of this is identified, hopefully, with some help in regard to the screen that is up on there and the labels that are given. If you want to take some time to look at it on your own and look at it a bit more differently and closely, then feel free to do so. But just wanted to kind of give you an idea or a picture. That's actually a valley that is well known even to this day. So this is actually where it happened. Sometimes that doesn't happen. When you go to the Bible lands and you do some visiting and sightseeing, tourism is what it is. You go to the place, and as a result of the Catholic churches and the Orthodox churches, their influence, they will say that there are certain, this is where that happened, when in reality it isn't, or you don't know for certainty. There's no way of knowing. But there are certain things, like where Peter lived, and in Capernaum and the Sea of Galilee that is there, and certain ruins and all where you can know where these things actually are, and this is one of them. Valley of Elah, it's never gone into obscurity. They've always known exactly where it is, and so you can kind of go and look and see what was happening on that occasion. But let's spend a little bit of time talking about the text of 1 Samuel itself, and I want to start off in verse 4. Verse 4, going through verse 7 of the text and looking at that summary, and there are a few points that I want to make. First of all, let's describe Goliath. Let's spend just a few moments discussing the Philistine champion. And understand this is the challenge that was given. Let's settle this one-on-one, and that's not something that was uncommon. There are other examples in literature and history of these kinds of things happening, but the champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath. His height was 6 cubits and a span. Had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail. The weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders, and the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. So there's the description of Goliath. Very imposing figure. Now, it's as is the case in many of these instances, there are individuals who are, in fact, referred to skeptics or modernists, or individuals who feel like it's necessary to demean the narration by saying, in effect, it's not as big a thing as you think it is, because he probably had some growth problem, and he probably, because he had so much weight, he couldn't move very good, and David got lucky and hit him in the head, and it wasn't a big thing. Instead of recognizing that the Lord was behind all of this, and he was an imposing figure. We see that he was an imposing figure because the army was afraid of him. They were afraid to go out, and so there is something to be said about how physically imposing Goliath was, and he taunted them. Now, looking at his physical size and such, I do want to note this is not an exaggeration. You say that with regard to cubits, 18 to 20 inches, a span is half of a cubit, 9 to 10 inches, and so conservatively, Goliath was about 9 foot 9 inches tall, maybe a bit taller if you do the royal cubit. And that measurement, he would be about 10 foot, 10 inches tall, so he's a big man. But Robert, what's his name? Robert Wadlow, in the book of the Guinness Book of Records. That man, you see pictures of him every once in a while, and he was 8 foot, 10 inches tall, tallest man ever lived. But he died when he was 22 because of complications that he had. Or he'd have kept growing. No telling how tall he would have gotten. Now, I'm not saying that gigantism, which was caused by the thyroid problems or whatever in Warlow, that's what Goliath had. I'm just saying that it's not out of the realm of possibility to have this giant of a man standing on this location and challenging the people of Israel. We don't have to try to diminish the narration or say it's an exaggeration or hyperbole to note that this actually was happening. And so we're told the Philistine in verse 10 of the text, chapter 17, the Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day to give me a man that we might fight together. And Saul, who himself was an imposing figure, remember, standing head above all the rest of Israel, when Saul and all of Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. Now, that's one of the phrases that I want you to remember. They were dismayed and they were greatly afraid. And the Philistine drew near, and he presented himself for 40 days, morning and evening. Well, then we get into the discussion about David. David was a young shepherd. He was the son of Jesse, the youngest son of Jesse, as we know, sent by his father with provisions for his sons, his 3 sons that were in the army. The brothers of David. They were with Saul. They were in the army. They were among those who were unwilling to volunteer to go and to fight Goliath. And so when David saw the circumstances that were present, he made that offer. An interesting phrase or explanation is given in chapter 17, verse 31 concerning that. It said, the words which David spoke were heard. So David said, I'll do it. Here's a young, ruddy man, a boy who was willing to do what none of the warriors of Israel were willing to do. And so they went and said, okay, went to the king, said, we've got someone here who's willing to fight Goliath. And so Saul sent for him. And we're told in verse 32 that David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. Now, I want you just to imagine what it was like for the king, as he was, again, a large man himself, and presented before him was this youth that was not even in his army who offered to fight, and Saul really didn't want that to happen. He objected initially. He understood or thought that it would be like throwing a lamb to the slaughter. But there were compelling things that David had to say about this with regard to the protection that God would afford him. So when David began to talk about the prowess of killing the bear and killing the lion and how God had allowed him to protect his sheep, maybe some of the things that David had to say had a little bit of an effect upon Saul, because he eventually let him do it. Looking at those words in verses 36 through 37, David said, your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing that he has defied the armies of the living God. And understand the reasoning behind this. David was not basically blowing his own horn. He wasn't trying to exalt himself as some great warrior. The reason why the Philistine would fall, because he had defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. So there is, I think, a very strong argument at this point in time. Saul, no doubt, was still at least being able to be touched by words about the Almighty God of heaven and how God would protect, because God had actually exalted him to the place of king over the people. And so these words were stated. And I do want you to note that the idea of God's providence or protection was the reasoning behind David. It was not, hey, I've done it to a lion, I've done it to a bear, I'm really good with this sling, so send me out and Goliath is going to fall just like they did. No, he said, the Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion, from the paw of the bear. He'll deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. And so Saul said to David, go and the Lord be with you. And we find out, of course, the actual contest. And we're not going to spend a great deal of time. We know that the stone was thrown. It was hit Goliath in the forehead, and Goliath died. So he killed the giant with the help of God, as he said he would. Do remember a few things about this particular battle, however. The first is that David, though he tested Saul's armor, he wasn't willing to use Saul's armor. He didn't need Saul's armor, and he understood that he didn't need the armor of Saul. He went to the creek, he gathered those 5 smooth stones. He listened to the ridicule of the giant who made fun of him for what he was attempting to do. But then he killed him, and he cut off his head with Goliath's own sword. And I do want you to note in the reading of 1 Samuel 17 in verses 48 through 51 of the text, verses 48 through 51, he said, it was that when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in the bag, took out the stone, slung it, struck the Philistine in his forehead so that the stone sank into his forehead. He fell on his face to the earth. And David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David, though. So David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And so it's one thing, to say, look at us, we're behind Goliath, but then their champion was gone, and through the might of this young boy, all their courage was gone, and we are told there that they fled. So here and I say here for better or for worse, and what I mean by that is as a result of this rout of the Philistines and David's prowess as the warrior who came from God, those things were established on this occasion, and it cost David an awful lot. I mean, this was him doing God's will, and eventually, indeed, he was given the glory of the kingdom of God, and so he was blessed to a very great extent, but his life was miserable for a period of time simply because he did what needed to be done. And so they saw the champion was dead, they fled, and the men of Israel, this is verse 51 and 52, the men of Israel and Judah arose, shouted, pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley to the gates of Ekron. The wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. So the victory was total. It brought the praise of Israel. But what else did it bring? it brought the ire of King Saul. And that's an interesting thing to end our narrative with, going to the next, well, let's go to 1 Kings chapter 18. So we'll see a parallel reading of that. 1 Kings chapter 18, that David, as a consequence of this, Saul used him, and everywhere that Saul sent David, he went out. Now this was, again, victory for Israel. The reputation of David is settled. Everyone knows what's going on. He used David. He said he sent him out, and David behaved wisely, did absolutely nothing wrong, but Saul set him over the men of war. So he was accepted in the sight of the people and in the sight of Saul's servants. So everyone liked David. It happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines and with joy and with musical instruments. And the women sang. Notice their message. He said, Saul has slain his thousands. Okay, that's good. That's good. They're singing for Saul. That's the purpose they're coming. But David's here. Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. This was praise. This is intended to glorify both of these men. But Saul was very angry. The saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s. To me they have ascribed only thousands. Well, all of it was most probably an exaggeration. It's hyperbole as they're singing these songs. And the intent was not in any way to demean Saul. It was simply to extol what David had done and what he had accomplished. But Saul was very angry, and he eyed David from that day forward. And then, as you know, as we relate the various attempts that Saul made on David's life, and how he escaped those things with the help of God, with the providence of God, and ultimately the kingdom was taken away from Saul and it was given to David. So, this epic struggle, it thrills the hearts of children as well as adults. It is a neat thing to read. It's wonderful to go to the Judges and to go to 1 Samuel and read about Samson and read about Gideon, and we read about David on this particular occasion, and we just in our mind's eye imagine what it must have been like to have God on your side and to be able to basically overcome the odds without trouble, because God was with you. And of course, you can even go back to Moses and the Passover and all of those kinds of things to see that kind of an epic struggle, which is why we teach our children these things, so that we'll know the massive nature of God's help and His providence toward us. But there are a few lessons that I want to share with you today, just very brief things that I want to talk about. We'll see if we've got enough to finish to the end of the hour, but I have 3 things that I want to develop somewhat. 3 basic points to learn from the battle. The first thing is how fear can debilitate us. It truly can debilitate us. The men of Israel were told in verse 11 of 1 Samuel 17, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. That's the phrase that I wanted you to note, as the Philistine champion taunted and defied them, as we see there in verse 11. In verse 24, the men of Israel, when they saw the man flee from him, they were dreadfully afraid. That is indicated there. But David had courage. Did he have reason to have courage? And so I said, well, no, not at all, because he was just a young boy. But he did have courage, and he had reason because he knew that God was on his side. That's the key, and that's what we need to understand as Christians today, because the world, it can be a daunting situation. I brought up Revelation a number of times already, and I apologize if I keep going back to it. It's such a wonderful book, but it also is one that's in my mind because we're studying it on Thursdays. And one thing to keep in mind is that the book of Revelation was written to a group of people who were suffering dire persecution at the time in which it was written. There are different views as to when it was written, but whether it was the Jewish persecution in about AD 70 and before then, or if it was the persecution under Domitian, the Roman emperor, and for those who ascribe to that later date, great persecution was being experienced by the churches and by Christians everywhere. And you can just imagine how afraid they would be to worship, to get out, to proclaim the faith that God said that they were to proclaim. It would be a very difficult thing, a very dangerous thing. We don't have to worry about that in America, at least not to this this date, as we still have religious liberty. I don't know how much longer it will last, but we're blessed now to be able to do this without fear that some jackbooted thug's going to come through the back door and arrest us all, or do something even worse in persecuting us, maybe even to death. Now, we might have to worry about a jackbooted thug, but not from the government, at least not right now. And as a result of that, we feel a lot more empowered to express our faith and to worship God. Everyone drove here. You didn't take any side roads. We didn't have to go down into any catacombs and hide ourselves from the prying eyes of the public in order to accomplish these things. It did happen once during COVID to us. In our congregation. It's an interesting thing. Texas is very nice about allowing you to worship, but when it was all shutting down at the first, the rule in Texas was that you could only have about 10 people in the building, and they could basically allow you to use the cameras and send it out to everybody else at their house. So we did it 1 week, and I'd gone down to the police department, and I asked them, is there anything else that we can do in order to meet together? Because there are convictions from some in our congregation that they're going to have to defy you and meet anyway, even if you don't say it's allowed. And they said, well, if you do that, you're going to be arrested for trespassing, is what they said. Trespassing on our own property. I just didn't quite understand the nature of that, but that's what the DA said. So is there anything we can do? Well, if you observe the how many ever feet between the chairs and all, you can meet outside. And so I said, okay, we'll do that. And he said, well, just keep in mind that you might get some objection from the public when you do. The very first Sunday that we met outside, here come the cops. And I'm finishing my sermon, and I went and talked to them, so it was at the end. And I said, is there a problem? He said, no, you are doing exactly what you want to do. We're not going to bother you at all. I just want you to know that someone drove by and saw it, and they called and complained. So it can happen even in America. I think we've all learned that with regard to COVID, that maybe some limitation, something is not going to allow us, and again, whatever your conviction is as to whether they were doing it for our good and those kinds of things, that's not the point. The point is that the government can do this. They just haven't done it. But in other times, that's exactly what they did. And so there is great fear that other people can have, or that we could have. Even the ridicule of friends, or the problems that arise by showing our faith is something that can come up from time to time, because that fear is something that debilitates. But we ought not to fear our opponents. God is greater than our opponents. I want you to note in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 4 through verse 6, this point. Spiritual enemies, whether it be error, worldliness, immorality, pride. What John says is, you are of God, little children. You've overcome them, because he who is in you is greater than he who is in the world, and they are of the world. Therefore, they speak as the world hears them, but we are of God. He who knows God hears us, and he who is not of God doesn't hear us, but this is how we know the spirit of truth and of error. But I just love this explanation. It is a call to boldness, because you are of God. He calls them little children. John liked to do that. That was a favorite phrase of his. It was a term of endearment, but it also indicates very much how we are in regard to the world. We are vulnerable, just as a small child is vulnerable, because people are against us in certain circumstances. They are opposed to us in one way or another. But don't be afraid, because God is on your side. And if individuals, they understand the spirit of error, because that's what they're involved in, that's what they hear, well, so be it. But we know the spirit of truth. And we know that God hears us. And if God is with us, who can be against us? How about those who seek us harm? Matthew chapter 10, you're familiar with this passage, where Jesus said, don't fear him who can kill the body, but he cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who's able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground except or apart from your Father's will? But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Don't fear, therefore, because you are of more value than many sparrows. We don't have to be afraid. We can be bold. We can recognize, really, there is a limit as to even if we are in the worst circumstances we possibly can be. Let's go back to the first century. Let's go back to the suffering of the churches. And when Jesus told the Christians, some of you will suffer, put to death as a result of this, but you'll receive the crown of life. There is no reason for us to fear those who cannot destroy the soul. God is the one that we are to fear, and we are here to please Him. And if we are pleasing Him, we don't have to be afraid, no matter what men might do to us. Hebrews chapter 13 in verse 5, we are to have our conduct without covetousness and be content with the things that we have, because He Himself has said, I will never leave you, nor will I forsake you. And we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? Now, if you ask men that, what can he do to me? Whoa, that's what the news is all about. What men do to men. And typically, if it's the kind of news that we see on television, it's the bad things that men do to men rather than the good things, unless you're looking at the news on Saturday morning or Sunday morning. It's always about the bad things that men do to men. Well, what can men do to us? They can take our life, but they can't take our soul. And that's what is important for us to consider. So don't let fear debilitate you in the life that you're living for the Lord. You have to be bold. You have to be willing to stand for the Lord. The second thing that we will notice is that phrase, is there not a cause? And that was the title of the lesson, as you noted. And it is stated here in verse 28 of 1 Samuel 17. Because David's older brother basically disparaged the motives of David. Here David comes, and David, was he going to show off a little bit? He's just a youth. He's not even able to come and be a part of the army. And we're told that Eliab, which was his oldest brother, heard that he spoke to the men, that Eliab became very angry. He said, why did you come down here? With whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. Now, look at that first. He still didn't ascribe to him to participate in the battle. But what he's saying, the pride and the insolence, is that you have basically done something your father doesn't want you to do. Because the father had kept back David for the purpose of keeping the sheep, of being that shepherd. You remember, though, that it was the father that gave instructions to David to go and to help his brothers. So David wasn't violating anything at all. So Eliab basically was jumping to conclusions here. And he said, I know your pride and I know your insolence. In other words, rather than doing what God, what your father wants you to do, you determined to do what you want to do. Okay? And that was wrong. And we know that it was wrong. We understand David's motivation, his desire to serve God. It was pure. It was something to be commended. It's a very simple and kind of a silly illustration that I want to share with you once. But when I was in high school, it's a long time ago, I was on the basketball team. And as a junior, we practiced, and we didn't practice on Wednesday evenings. And the changes that went on, Wednesday next year came around. Now I'm a senior. I'm one of the starters on the team. And I told the coach, I can't come on Wednesday. What do you mean you can't come on Wednesday? I said, well, I have to go to Bible class on Wednesday. And he harumphed and went away, and then he came back and he said, he said, last year you didn't have to go to Bible class, and this year you've got a girlfriend, and now all of a sudden you have to go to Bible class? That was kind of insulting, wasn't it? But that was his mind and the way he was thinking. He jumped to conclusions. I said, sir, last year we didn't practice on Wednesday, and I converted her. She didn't convert me. and so that was my explanation, and by the end of the season, I was off the team anyway, so it was for a different reason, but it was a mess in that occasion. But that idea, that jumping to conclusions, a person's motivations and the actions with regard to or behind it, they can be certainly misconstrued, and we've got to be careful about that. An individual who does something, it seems like it's the right thing to do until someone else comes along and says, no, you shouldn't do it. And you got to hear both sides. You have to know the explanations and recognize that and not to jump to conclusions. But in this case, that's what Eliab did. Now, in chapter 17 and verse 29, David's response was, well, what have I done? Now, is there not a cause? Is there not a reason for me to be here? He turned from him toward another. He said the same thing. Is there not a cause? So you can see David. Isn't there a reason? Isn't there a reason to say what I'm saying? Isn't there a reason for me to go out and for a champion to go and defy this man? And so we're told the people answered him as the first ones did. And when the words which David were heard, they reported them to Saul, and he sent for him. And that's when David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him, because I will go and fight. Is there not a cause? Is there not a cause? That's the question that we have to ask ourselves with regard to our spiritual lives and the lives of our brethren and the lives of our loved ones. Is there not a cause? And a battle is raging for our soul. The devil is a roaring lion that walks about seeking whom he may devour, and you need to be strong in the Lord, and you need to stand, and you need to be delivered by the Lord from the devil. The New Testament says it too, doesn't it? In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 10, very familiar passage, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of His might, and put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. We don't wrestle against flesh and blood. We wrestle against principalities, powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. So take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. All right, that's what we are to do. God is on our side. This is the armor of God, and we can withstand any evil with His help. But there is that cause. There is that need for us and for those that we love and those that we care for. The Apostle Paul gave instructions to a young man in the faith to save yourself and those who hear you. That was his intent in the preaching of the gospel. That's what Paul sought to do, to save himself and those who heard him, because there are enemies everywhere that are troubling the people of God today. They do it in every age. They have in every generation. There is immorality that is rampant in the land. There is doctrinal error that is prevalent. It is ubiquitous among churches that claim to be following Jesus Christ. There is spiritual apathy. And we see these same things. I've had to deal with religious error in our congregation because individuals began to teach something that is not true. I've had to deal with immorality in our very congregation, just as Paul had to do in Corinth with regard to that man in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 who was doing something even the Gentiles were ashamed of. It was so bad, and they were accepting him. And spiritual apathy, let me tell you something, I've had to deal with that. And every congregation has to deal with those kinds of problems that exist in and among the Lord's people, because we live in this world. And there are too many who are not willing to say, just like these soldiers who were afraid, who were not willing to say, as David did, is there not a cause? And that's why there is the language throughout Scripture of warfare, of militants that you find. Remember what Paul wrote to Timothy: fight the good fight of faith. Lay hold on eternal life, to which you were called, and have confessed the good confession in the presence of many witnesses. How about Jude? Remember, he wanted to talk about the current and common salvation that they had in verse 3 of Jude 3, but he said in the latter part of that verse and into verse 4, he said, I found it necessary to write to you, to exhort you to contend earnestly for the faith which was once for all delivered to the saints. That's what was needed. He said, because certain men, now here, is there not a cause? Certain men have crept in unnoticed, who long ago were marked out for the condemnation, ungodly men who turn the grace of God into lewdness, deny the Lord God, the only Lord God, and our Lord Jesus Christ. I can give you another example in Acts the 20th chapter with regard to the Apostle Paul as he talked to the elders of Ephesus while they were in Miletus, the last time he was going to see them. He said, I did not stop night and day to declare to you the whole counsel of God, but you guys, you need to be careful, because ravenous wolves are going to come in, even from your own number, and they're going to destroy the flock. And you've got to be aware. You've got to be on guard against these kinds of things, because there's a cause. There is a reason for us to fight the battles. And perhaps that's something for us to keep in mind. Let's talk about the first hour. God is great. He is our commander. He's the one who has the ability, the power to get us through the battle. But we are soldiers of Christ. This is a great battle that is ongoing. The battle is not for men. It is not for land. It is not for power. It is for our soul. And the existence of our soul, the continued blessing of our soul, is what hangs in the balance. Should that not give us not only our full attention, but also make it to where we will do what is needed. We will fight the battle. We will wield the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. We will hold the whole armor of God, the breastplate of righteousness, so that we may be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked one. You see the language? You see the metaphor? All this symbolism indicates that this is a business that we've got to be about. It is important. It is significant. It's not something that, well, you know, it's 8:45, it's time to get up and to go to worship, and then 3 hours later, okay, it's time to go, let's go eat, and then when do you think of it next? Next Sunday? Or maybe someone who doesn't wait until the 9 o'clock hour, but waits till the 11 o'clock hour to show up and say, okay, it's time to go, and then for the rest of the week, do you come back on Wednesday? Some don't. The apathy is real, it is there, but this imagery that we find of a battle, and how we are to conduct ourselves as soldiers, protecting ourselves but going to war with the devil. That's the imagery that you want to think about, and that's the imagery that is seen in regard to what was done on that occasion with David and Goliath. And then the third and final point that we want to share with you is that faith indeed is the victory. That's the key. Faith is the victory. It's always the key in winning our spiritual battles. Where all of the other men feared what would happen. That's what it was, wasn't it? Goliath defied them. These were soldiers. These were men, and we see the picture of soldiers, you know, going out, and their valor that is expressed through the giving of medals, and they're individuals who die for their country, and it is something that is typical, and it is something that is to be commended when you see men who are willing basically to give up their life and to go in to the teeth of the battle, knowing that most probably they're going to die. D-Day, the invasion, how many died as a result of that to accomplish the freedom and victory that we desired and needed? So men are willing to do it, but on this particular occasion, everyone was afraid. And they were scared. And the reason is because they did not consider the fact that God was on their side. I don't know if some of them doubted it or some of them just didn't think about it, but here they were arrayed against this great army. You can just see this army on the hill, and here they're on the other hill, drawn up in battle array, so they're all spread out. You've seen it on the television. I don't know if that's the way it actually happened. Doesn't make much sense for everyone to line up and just walk into each other, but that's maybe probably what happened at that particular time in battle. And okay, this is happening, and then some giant of a man comes down there and says, I want one person to come to battle me, to settle this once and for all. And no one wanted to do it. And every single one of them, from Saul on down to David's brothers, to every soldier there, could have defeated Goliath with God's help. If they would have said, I'm not afraid because the Lord is going to be the one to defeat you. It's not me. It's not my ability with a sling. It's not my ability to thrust with a sword. It's just that God is going to protect me and God is going to direct me. God is the one that's going to do it. So that's why David said in verse 37 of the text, it's the Lord. He delivered me from the paw of the lion. You've seen some lions at the zoos, some bears at the zoos. Okay, I don't want to get in the same container with them. But David said, I protected my sheep because God allowed me to. He delivered me, and He'll deliver me from the hand of the Philistine. In the same way, the strength of our faith in God is what gives us the ability to win our own battles. Now, in the third hour, we're going to talk about strengthening your faith. I've got just a kind of a little phrase here that will presage what we're going to talk about in the third hour. Prayer, study, meditation, assembly, activity, all of those kinds of things, they will help to strengthen your faith. That is your purpose in life. That's what you're supposed to be doing, to grow stronger, to more bold, to be more courageous as you contemplate God as your helper. There is a text again from John in 1 John, the 5th chapter. And this is verses 4 and 5 of the text there in 1 John. Very simple statement. And I love John's confidence. He said, whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. And who is he who overcomes the world? It's he who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. That's the key. That's what we have to do is believe. We have to have faith because faith is the victory that overcomes the world. That's what that song comes from, that particular text right there in 1 John, the 5th chapter. Have you ever noticed, because John does it, Peter does it, but John is a very good example of this. When you go through John's writings, his phrase, I know, again and again and again and again, I know, it indicates assurance. Now we ask the question, why was he so sure of his standing with God? And we actually asked kind of a similar question in our discussion last night. The idea of how can you be so sure and how can you be so certain? It's not because of your own abilities, as we saw with regard to David. But Peter and him both, it wasn't because like Elijah was a prophet. It wasn't like because they were apostles, because of any assurance that they had given. The Apostle Paul, he did everything that he did just in case or lest he become a castaway. The Apostle Peter, as is revealed in Paul's letter to the Galatians, had become a hypocrite and was carrying individuals away and needed to be admonished as a result of his sin. And he thanked Paul about it later in 2 Peter chapter 3 for doing such a thing, and called him the beloved brother Paul, and talked about all of the scriptures which he had written. But the reason why Paul and Peter and all of the others that had that assurance is because they did what God told them to do and God promised them. And that's what we need to have in our faith. Are you going to heaven? Can you lay your head down when you go to bed at night with comfort in knowing that should God take you that evening, that you'll go to heaven? Some say, well, I'm not sure. Well, why not? He promised you it. Are you living for Him or not? Have you repented of your sins? Are you striving to live righteously? Are you doing His commands? That's what He requires of you. If you're doing it, then if you are acting righteously, you're taking care of any sins that you do commit, you can lay down at night, and if you die, you know. When we preach funerals, why do we preach funerals and say to some, he has the hope of a Christian? Well, that hope is that expectation, isn't it? We not only desire it, but we think we're going to get there. Well, I don't know the heart of any of you. You may be a hypocrite, as far as I know, but presenting myself as a preacher when there is a person who has lived faithfully, I know this, that if his life is as he said it was and as he showed me that it was, he's going to heaven. And I can know that for a certainty because God promised that type of life, if that is indeed the life he lived, if he wasn't being a hypocrite, that kind of life is the life that I know guarantees an eternity in heaven. I can't do that with everyone I preach a funeral for. I tell you, it's a very difficult thing. I've had to do it a few times where someone has asked me, a extended family member, and this person, he's a good old boy, but he's never darkened the door of a church, and so I can't just say, well, he's with Elvis in heaven playing his guitar for God. It just doesn't work that way. So I've got to talk about the family, and I've got to talk about his love for his family and how good a worker he was, and then I deign, usually it works, I say, his life is over, but I do know one thing, he wants you to go to heaven. And then I talk about heaven for a few moments. But I can't say he went to heaven. But for the Christian, I can. And the reason is, it is a certain thing that if you're living as a Christian, God has promised that you will go to heaven. So this fear is not the way it should be. It should be faith. And faith is indeed what brings out that victory. So let's go to that final conclusion as we draw our lesson to a close today. David didn't defeat Goliath because he was physically stronger. He was victorious because he trusted in God, who is stronger than all. He is unique, isn't he? He's the one great being in the universe who can do whatever his will is, and he has extended his will to us. Notice 1 Samuel 17 as we end this lesson. All this assembly shall know that the Lord doesn't save with sword and spear. The battle is the Lord's, and He will give you into our hands. Trust and obey in Jesus. He will give you salvation. Christians are more than conquerors through Him who loved us. Thank you very much for your kind attention.